Hello everyone, it is me, GamePenguin21, and today, well, I'm coming to you in the VR flesh because something obviously happened in the VR universe, and quite honestly, I have some thoughts on it. Now, I'm not wearing my full body today, which is why I'm being filmed from the waist up, so you don't see my legs doing anything weird going on. So, yeah, if I'm moving weird, that's probably the reason why. Anyway, today I wanted to take a look at a little bit of a Twitter thread that I saw come across my timeline. Now, this Twitter thread, more or less, wasn't anything huge or massive or even anything that spectacular. But I wanted to talk about it because it kind of shows some sort of weird thing that seems to be happening, at least in terms of the mainstream media, I think. Again, I'm not too certain if this is one person's individual, but it seems to be a little bit out of touch, and I just wanted to give my opinion on it. So, I am, of course, referring to this tweet here. This tweet is someone who basically created the Google Cardboard. Now, the Google Cardboard was a pretty not so good, but very early on demonstration as to what VR could be, in the sense that VR itself was an interesting medium, but it was different because it was the phone VR. If you only really, and one of the big complaints, I guess, from the early days of phone VR being a huge thing was that it wasn't actually representative of the rest of the actual industry. It was merely a small sample size sliver that was a thing for a while. AR is better on phones and stuff, and again, the Google Cardboard I think came out like over 5 to 10 years ago. I don't even remember when it came out. But as someone who worked on it, you obviously or clearly don't seem to know what the heck you're actually talking about, or at least if that's your only frame of reference. I have a few thoughts on that. So, yeah, out of the gate, this is a very weird tweet. So I wanted to take a look at the whole thing just so we could get a little bit of context here. So I'm just going to move over a little bit just so I have enough room to put the tweets in the thing. So, yeah, again, so we'll be referring to this guy here, saying that he created the Google Cardboard almost 10 years ago. Okay, I guess it was almost 10 years ago. But quit VR soon after to focus on machine learning, aka I think it's AI, what he's referring to. VR is based on a ridiculous misunderstanding. Let me explain in this thread. And we're going to take a look at this thread. So, yeah. Now, this person here seems to be Damien Henry? I'm not gonna censor out his name or anything, so don't send out his hate. I'm more or less gonna take this as an opportunity to just give out some basic criticism and stuff. And again, don't really mind the mic quality; it's not normally the mic that I use, so there's also that. But yes, he has a podcast apparently, and also does like AI stuff. So again, this is one of those things where it's very weird coming across this, and the only reason why I came across this was because of other VR YouTubers and other VR people kind of commenting on this. But I wanted to make a whole video because I'm better explaining things when I talk. So here we go. So the next part of this thread is the VR promise is a big sense of presence to compounding. Is that how you say that word? But the sense of presence, seeing things as if they were there, adds a little value beyond the wahoo effect it generates. The misunderstanding is between immersion and sense of presence. Now, I guess that I can see where he's coming from on this. The sense of presence, at least in the VR standards, more or less comes down to how you believe you are acting or reacting within the world. For example, in my personal home world, which I'm currently sitting in right now, I actually have a few toys and things that I tend to have around. I also have a bed over in that corner and the couch behind me. It's not really a sense of the actual scale of my room or anything, but it's more of the scale and presence of being within a space with other people. The sense of presence and the immersion kind of do go hand in hand, but they're also a little bit separate. But there's a lot where they tend to overlap, at least from my personal experience and personal opinion. One of the biggest things here is that the sense of presence is actually enhanced for a lot of people who exclusively play VR games. Speaking again from personal experience, there is a little known psychological phenomenon that's not just tied to VR, but has a very big place in the VR community called phantom sense. Now, phantom sense is the sense of presence of another person's being acting upon yourself, or the sense of touch on your person. Most people have it within the face or around the head area, but anyone who has more extreme versions can feel any sensation from actual sensation of a person's body heat, of another person standing close to them, to actual physical pain, to some people even having actual reactions that are based on that. I've only know of one person who has asthma who actually can have an asthma attack if he's around someone who's even just VR smoking, apparently. But that's what he said, allegedly. Anyway, moving on to the next bit here. Listening to a good story is emerging. Our brain's capacity to immerse ourselves in someone else's idea is a superpower that allows us to co-create. Now, he's again not wrong here. But I do have an issue with the way that he's using immersion and a sense of presence. Now, the sense of presence bit is again seeing and reacting with your limbs. I had a bunch of people who I know personally in my life when I went to college, and I asked them a bunch of questions about VR stuff. This was mainly about a different topic entirely, but it was more about the legs in VR, but it's still kind of related in some way, shape, or form. It's related because I asked them about VR legs and whether they would rather have them or not have them. And the majority of them said absolutely. And that right there is the difference between sense of presence and regular immersion. You can get immersed in pretty much anything if you really set your mind to it. But a true person can establish a presence within a space to allow them to interact with the world. There's a very big, small difference, but it makes a big difference in the long term. Next in the thread is: reading a book is real immersion. When immersed in a book, our senses are disconnected, from our bodies, and we no longer feel our direct environment. Reading a book is decoding black symbols on white page. Our brains decode these abstract symbols, creating virtual world inside of our brains. There is no need for brain implants. We can already read the Matrix. Now, I again have to say that he does make a point here, but this point is very misconceptual and actually seems to be warped from the original point that he's trying to make here. His original point was that sense of presence and immersion are not mutually exclusive, but he seems to be using them as mutually exclusive anyway. Now, again, this is one of those traps that a lot of people tend to fall into, especially with languages such as the English language, because words can be spelt the same but mean totally different things, and can even be pronounced the same but are spelt completely differently. As someone who suffers from dyslexia personally, this is a fucking disgusting language, and I'd much rather not get too much more into it than that. But to get to his point here, no. While yes, we can read the Matrix, the problem becomes that the sense of presence is only personal, i.e., you can only share it with one other person. The sense of presence that most people in the VR space, in the VR industry, tend to talk about is shared presence. Shared presence being, or at least from my understanding of shared presence, is where you can share an experience with other people while not necessarily being in the same room. You can, and there's definitely places like VR arcades where you can absolutely 100% do that and have like 5 different people running around one VR space, or even just having 2 or 3 in your own personal home. Absolutely. But at the same time, my problem is that the VR presence and the VR immersion that he's talking about is, again, one of those warped experiences where he thinks it is only personal to you. And that's true, but only about half correct when you're talking about full VR immersion and full VR presence. A VR person, or not really an expert, but a VR enthusiast like myself, understands the difference. Yes, I can basically go out and play Half-Life Alyx all day, and that would be basically me being immersed and being a presence in a game. But I much prefer VR chat, even though it's jankier, not made by the same engine, not made by the same people, and has a lot of fucking bugs. I tank those bugs because of the fact that, in all honesty, one of, if not the biggest problems with most actual games was the fact that it was harder for me, or it's not necessarily harder for me, but I've always been a person who can get pretty immersed in any video game, even just 2D ones. But overall, What I'm saying here is that the experience that you get personally out of something is not necessarily the same as the essence you share a personal experience or personal presence with someone else. Again, it's one of those things where it's very personal, but at the same time, VR allows you to share that more than just telling someone a story. We are immersed when we are focused on our inner thoughts, controlled by some external signals. VR takes the problem the wrong way. It tries to immerse us by fooling our sensory system. VR is lying to our bodies. That's why most VR experiences are unpleasant after a couple of minutes. Okay, this point is where he goes completely off the rails, in my opinion. And in all honesty, as someone who has spent over 4K hours now in VR chat, as well as thousands upon thousands of hours in other places and in other VR spaces, no, not really. You can probably say the maximum amount that even I play, as just a general casual person, would be about 6 to 8 hours. At least in terms of, maybe not daily, but at least within the week, I will put at least 6 to 10 hours within that week, if not more. Because I like this game. And again, putting in that amount is basically the same as having maybe a very lenient part-time job. And yeah, certainly, VR does tend to trick you in that way. But I will bring him back to his original other argument and say that the book is actually doing the same thing. Now, it's in a very roundabout way, but the book is still doing it more, and it's doing it in a self-reliance that the person has to put in the most of the effort. Yes, VR does do a lot of shortcuts and does have a lot of the actual thing and trying to tricking our brains and stuff. And I did bring up the psychological elements a little bit earlier, but I'm going to bring it up again with actual phantom touch and actual phantom pain and stuff like that. Again, all psychological. But whereas books themselves can only exist in here in the brain, again, it comes back to what I said earlier. VR is more about immersion out in this VR world as well. It's a push and pull relationship from, again, what I interpret this as. Now, again, my interpretation is not the mass majority of people, but a lot of people do seem to understand that there is definitely a difference between reading a book, which is very passive, and you are experiencing the story, the world, the elements very passively, but in a VR setting, you are actively involved. It's the same sort of thing where back in the day, people said that video games would rot your brain. Now, this is a thing that has been going on for a long time with a long history, and we will not go into that here. But to bring it down to its most basic components, when video games started to come out and when video games started to become more realistic and more violent and more different to what people thought video games were about, things like the ESRB were created, as well as regulations for specific aspects, what could be in games, what could be out of games, blah, 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 blah. And overall, video gaming became more of a bigger medium. VR is now going through that same phase where it's getting criticized in a similar way, but not exactly the same way. Imagine how many articles you've seen of where VR is dead and where VR doesn't exist and the VR market is not really growing at the rate at which it was expected, blah, blah, blah. All the negative Nancy's out there. Now, again, that's not to say that VR industries aren't growing or they aren't expanding. It's just that they're not growing and expanding at the rate of which other people expected them to. So it's very gray area. So I have no opinion on that. But what does all of that have to do with this tweet? Well, again, to bring it back to what it was, he's saying that he doesn't like it because he cannot get into the immersion, or he thinks that it's some sort of bad trick or bad trip that you will get whenever you do that. Again, this is not to say that this person's opinion is wrong. In fact, I agree with about half of it. That yes, books are like getting immersed in another world. Video games are like getting immersed in another world. And VR does trick your senses in a lot of ways. But where he loses me is in the fact that he says that VR has failed because it takes it in the wrong direction. No, it's just taking it in a direction that's different. That you don't seem to agree with, at least from what I can tell with this tweet here. But we will go and we'll finish off this tweet, and then I'll finish off with my actual full-length thoughts here. Next up, we have our participations fade away when we are immersed. Oh, our perceptions. My mistake again. Our perceptions fade away when we are immersed. For instance, while reading a book on the tube, on the other end, VR uses our bodies and senses as on the other end, VR uses our body and senses as a medium, distracting us from the story, the message, and the real thing we want to be immersed in. Ironically, VR is a bad medium because the only immersion that matters is the immersion of our minds. I mean, again, I don't completely disagree with this point. Saying that the immersion exists within our brains is actually good. But at the same time, I would argue that it's more immersive to put your body on the line here. I know several people who have broken so many headsets because they have put their body, their headset, their equipment, and everything on the line because they want to be more immersed. People will spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to try to make the best rig that they possibly can to try to actually get the most out of the eyes so you don't have the effects that you normally get whenever you do this sort of thing, where you don't have these like circles and stuff on your eyes, where you don't have a giant poster strapped to your head. All of these different ones are meant to increase and are meant to decrease the amount of bodily harm and decrease the amount of injury, I guess. I don't know what he's really saying here, but I would argue that it's more immersive when you run around an actual place and actually get tired within a space that you can kind of be in. It's more immersive to feel another person's body heat who's not actually there. It's more immersive to actually see and interact with the full-on world. And again, this is coming from someone who hasn't worked in the VR space for 10 years. 10 years, mind you, where he only exclusively immersed himself or worked on the mobile Google Play version of what VR is. VR has come so very far away from that initial point because everyone realized that phone VR was not actually worth the development, or at least it wasn't worth it in the short term. So therefore, it doesn't exist in the long term. And it's not really. Because again, if you have a device like a computer or a phone that can do practically everything, it cannot do everything right. I think the best way to do it is to just put it into knives. See, I am a knife guy, and I like to collect knives. So does my dad. But each knife that my dad collects has a specific purpose, and those specific purposes come at different prices. I'll use his carving set versus my multi-tool, for example. My multi-tool can do a bunch of different things. It can be a hammer, it can be a crowbar, it can be an axe splitter, it can be even a saw, or a bunch of other things, a pair of pliers. Take your pick of whatever multi-tool you will function at. And yeah, there are hammers that do exist on multi-tools, so don't at me in the comments there and come at me with that weird shit. I have weird shit. I've seen it. But at the same time, my dad has carving tools. And yes, there are more knives, but all of those knives are meant for specific purposes. Each one is not handcrafted, but each one is made to create and establish to a specific degree. It's the same thing with like just a regular pocket knife that's one-bladed versus a multi-tool. The multi-tool is good at a bunch of different things, but it doesn't do all of them correctly and sometimes can get uncomfortable and is not as important or doesn't specialize in one area. Whereas with the knife, you have one knife that is good at only a handful of things, but does those handful of things really well. And that's the difference here. The difference between a phone VR versus a VR actual dedicated headset, whether standalone or not, is that they are good at one thing, and that is improving your VR immersion, at least in terms of current day. When he was around, maybe that wasn't the case. But even when he was around, there was still a ton of innovations in the PC market, not so much in the phone market. So, yeah. It's one of those things where when I look at this tweet, that just goes to show that a lot of his information seems to be out of date. And overall, that's where the tweet seems to end for me. I think that there was one or two more parts here, but that's probably his main points there, where he basically brings all of that immersion out of this. So, in short, what did we learn here today? Well, we learned the following, that yes, VR does tend to trick your mind. VR does have a lot of problems when it comes to immersion because there are several different issues with it. But it's not for the reasons that were listed within this tweet. It's not just a passive medium that you can just exist in, like a movie or something like that. Maybe it used to be back when the Google Cardboard came out. Absolutely, it was much more passive, at least on the platform where it was more standalone, i.e., phones and stuff. But today, you can get fully realized, actual immersive games that exist within the entirety of the industry. Not just in hardware specs either, but a lot of the software has come along as well. Things like Half-Life Alyx, things like VR chat, things like even Neos and stuff like that, even though Neos is now dead, unfortunately. Oops. Anyway, not important. What is important is the following. A game such as VR chat or any of the other stuff that has been listed off as immersive experiences, all of them, every single one is immersive in its own special way. And their sense of presence is not just because you yourself exist in the world, but that the world itself is not only being created around you by someone else, but you are able to interact with it in a way today that you wouldn't be able to even just 10 years ago. I mean, again, you could ride a VR roller coaster, you could throw a VR snowball, but today you can track each individual finger to the point of where each one knows how far away that finger is from you. You can track your individual legs and kick your friends in the balls. You can go out and actually to a bar, to a club, to experience music that you've probably never heard of by a DJ who is thousands upon thousands of miles away, but is still standing behind an actual deck and stuff. You can get drunk, you can play pool, you can do this, you can do that. There is a lot of there's a lot of immersion in the world, but if you can't get into it, that's unfortunate. And yeah, maybe again, there can be some improvements along the way with immersion by getting better optics for your headset, getting wider fields of view to cover more of your eyes so you're not pulled out of the experience. But when you are in the zone, much like he said, even when you're reading that book, it's the same with VR. You tend to just melt away into this world. And yeah, VR is not as immersive as it could be. But there are a lot of things that VR does do to improve the immersion. I think I've actually rambled on about this enough. So those are my thoughts on this tweet, and I would like to hear yours in the comment section down below. I know that this is probably like a more older one because other stories came about to this, but I wanted to cover this one before it became too stale to talk about because I like VR, and VR is one of those things where I made a few videos on it. And yeah, sorry for again the mic quality, but I'm using a microphone on this video. So new actual videos to be coming out every Tuesday at the very least, but I tend to also update usually on Thursdays or Fridays, and sometimes even Saturdays like this earlier video was. If you like what it is that I do, want to support me in any way, shape, or form, links down to everything, all the socials, even the Patreon, as well as the gumroad and stuff, down in the description below. I also, again, have done and opened up some commissions for them. Maybe not too many, as I'm not the best artist, and I mainly will do 3D stuff now, because I am an asset guy. If anyone wants anything, be sure to message me and DM me and whatever the fuck down below. In any case, my name is GamePenguin21. Thank you all so much for watching, and a peace off.